Hey there everybody and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. Today we are making Wonder Bread. This is my trying to catch up on the nodevember thing because I'm still a day behind. Wonder Bread I made because the prompt was wonder and I'm like, you know, what's more wonderful than bread? But we're going to be making the bread procedurally. We're going to shrink wrap it with some casing that we're going to put the dots on, and it should be pretty interesting. So let's get started. By the way, blend file going to be in Patreon and Gumroad. Let's begin. Geometry nodes, get rid of everything. Start a cube, make the cube a geonodes thing, delete the thing, where we have a starting point. What is a piece of bread? A piece of bread is a square and two circles. It looks like I'm drawing boobs, but no, this is bread. Where we're going to do that and then apply a bunch of operations until it looks like bread. So I'm going to start with a grid. This is going to be our square. And I'm going to also add in a circle. And really the name of the game here is combining these in kind of the correct orientation and all this, so it looks like a piece of bread, if you know what I mean, right? Because if you were just to drop a circle on here, it doesn't look that good. So I'm just going to play with this until it looks right. So I'm going to bring down the radius. I'm actually going to smush this a little on the, I'm clicking everything incorrectly, on the y-axis. And then to mirror this, we can transform this again using a new transform node, so it doesn't have any of the settings from before, and scale it by -1 on the x-axis, join this together. So what I've done here, that was a lot of clicking. We have a square, we have a transformed circle, and then whatever I do to this, I've reflected this on the x-axis, which means we should also flip the faces. So if I now move this here, you can see there's this symmetrical thing going on. So I'm just going to play with this until it looks right to me. I think I want to rotate this on the z-axis a little, something like that, and then scale it a little down. And we'll see what that looks like. So there is our very impromptu piece of bread that doesn't actually look too bad. And now I want to give this thickness and make it actually look like bread. And you might be thinking, oh, give it thickness, right? That's an extrude mesh. I would not recommend that because it's still going to be a bunch of separated geometry, and I want more geometry to work with and this to be one kind of continuous mesh. So here's a trick to give it thickness. Use a mesh to volume node. This is going to give it volumetrics. Take the volume, bring it back to a mesh, and not only do we have thickness, but it's now this mesh that has more geometry everywhere, which is useful if we want to add in stuff like ridges and things like this. So let's actually save what we have so far. We'll call it very important bread. And that's kind of a bit of a, not a repetition. Like, we all know bread's important, so why do we have to call it important? It's kind of like a waste of words in a sense. That was me trying to be funny. Okay, so we have a piece of bread. I'm going to bring down the thickness of it. This is just going to be the bandwidth is what it turns out. And also run it through a shade smooth operation. That looks okay. And now what I want to do is focus on making, let me actually bump up the resolution a little. Now what I want to focus on is somehow making the crust. So if you think about it, if we isolate everything except the crust, this should be kind of extruded inwards a little, which is fine, and we also want this information to make the material, right? Like, we want the crust to be a different material than the inside. But the issue with this is we somehow need an edge detection algorithm. How do we know where the crust is? How do we know where the outside of this is? There's no simple solution, except here's what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is to get the edge, I'm going to basically, it's probably easier to just show you, isn't it? I'm going to delete, or instead of delete, I'm going to separate. This is a new trick I've been using recently because I always delete and then use the inverse. I'm going to separate geometry by looking at the position of this bread, looking at the Z component, so this up-down, looking at that selection, and I want to say, hey, separate it based on a compare function. So I'm going to compare it to 0 and give it some thickness. So what have I done here? I'm basically saying, hey, only show me the geometry where the z component is between 0.06 and negative 0.06. What does that look like? It looks exactly like the edge of the bread. So there's the magic. That's how we're going to do it. In other words, we have this mesh and this one, which is going to be useful for doing a geometry proximity, is the idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a proximity operation. So we want to say, hey, look at our separated geometry. Tell me how far you are from the faces or edges or whatever. And then based on this distance, we can extrude. So let's try that. And you can see it's doing some weird stuff, but it's kind of working, where it's only extruding on the top and the bottom. What we want to do is make this not horrible. So I want to say only extrude where the distance is greater than like a bit over 0, I think. So you can see we've made a little function that tells us how far away from the bread we are, or the crust we are. Isn't that useful? So I want to do it like this, and I want to make it less intense. So I'm going to multiply it by 0 and go a little negative. And you can see now we have a bit of a dip in our bread, and we actually know where the crust is based on the SDF, sign distance function. I'm actually going to save that sign distance function. What I mean is the geometry proximity output. So I'm going to call this crust. This is going to be useful for our map with the materials. Final part is adding in a bit of ridges. We'll do this a lot in the shader editor. But what we can do is what could we do? We could extrude again, only on the same selection. So let me do it like this. Only on the same selection, extrude. Is this what I want? Kind of looks like a disaster, but I think it's good. Let me multiply it by less. What is going on here? So I want to extrude the faces of anything that is... Whoa! What is going on, boys? Maybe we could oh wait, by the selection? And then make this 0? I'm very confused. Oh! We got rid of our multiplication before. Sorry, I know that was obvious. Okay, wait, let's view this. Make it a little negative, so this is exactly what we had before. And then this, we want to filter out by the selection. There we go. So what I want to do is I want to extrude this based on a procedural map. I'm going to use a Voronoi texture. And I'm going to make that less intense. And you can see what the Voronoi texture does is it kind of creates these ridges in the bread. Really what it's doing is it's distributing a bunch of points and saying, hey, how close are we to these points? And that's the map. But for our purposes, it will look like bread, especially as we bring up the scale. Something like that. By the way, still a bit sick, so sorry if that's, like, annoying. Okay. So that is our bread. Huh, really? We can control the crust. I'm going to make the crust a little closer to the edge. And I think that looks pretty good. By the way, we are going to make this look good, right, with the material, but bear with me. So there we have our piece of bread. Let's give it a nice material. So I'm going to do a set shade. What am I doing? I want to do a set material. And now let's carry this over with the material and shader editor. So now I'm on step 2, where anything, not a Steve Wallace reference, where no matter what we do to this material, since it's linked, I'm going to call it bread, and you can see it carries over. Whatever we do here affects it. So now let me set up, I always like to set up a bit of lighting before I start with my materials. So I'm changing to cycles. I'm loading up an HDRI. I'm going to do one big snot, boys. Okay, get ready. Oh, I feel so much better. Okay, sorry about that. So what we want to do is we want to bring in the attribute, the crust, which is actually going to kind of drive all of this. So you can see the crust is basically this SDF that is 0 on the crust, and it gets greater and greater as we go inwards towards the bread. Again, that's the stored attribute we got from the geometry proximity node. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to send this through a color ramp, Y, so that we can pick the colors of the bread. So where it's black, I want it to be this kind of dark brown, and this will take a while to get the correct colors for. So I want it to be this darkish brown. On the actual bread, I want it to first kind of be a bit toasted. So kind of like this yellow, kind of dark look. And then as we increase, it will become more and more white and desaturated. So that's going to be our base color for the bread. And that actually looks pretty good. So let's connect that. That's already looking a bit more like bread. What do you say? Another thing I'm going to do is the same thing I did before with the Voronoi texture, except this time I'm going to do it in the material. So I'm using object coordinates on the Voronoi. You can see it scatters a bunch of points. I'm going to add way more. And what I want to do is send this through a bump node. So it's the same trick as before, but now in the shader editor. So that's going to add a bit of graininess to our bread, bring down the scale there, and bring up the, do I want to bring it up? Yeah, bring up the scale, so they're tinier dots. That looks pretty good. I'm also going to mess with our color ramp, so it's a bit more toasted. You can see how I'm changing the colors. That looks pretty good. And by the way, the secret, so I know it looks like plastic, the secret to make bread or any food look good is in the subsurface. As we bring up the subsurface, light will leak through it. Specifically, I want it to be this kind of yellowish color. You want to bring the subsurface just slightly above 0. And that's going to make it look way more edible. So here's before, plastic, after. I think that's the biggest secret to making bread. What do I want to change? I think the crust is looking a bit saturated. Could it be darker? Brighter? Darker. Yes. And I want to bring down the gradient there a little. Okay. And I think finally, I'm going to mix this with the color black. So I'm going to multiply by the color black, which is to say darken some areas based on the factor. And that's going to be driven by an ambient occlusion node. So let's see what this looks like. I want to make this more high contrast, bring up the blacks. So it's really going to capture this rim. And also, if we get the bump normal in here, it will also bring in that information. So what I want to do is I want to invert this, or I could just invert the color. No, I'm just going to invert it. So it's only going to multiply wherever it's white. And I want this to be the factor. See what that looks like? Okay, there we go. So it's looking obviously a bit burnt. So I want to bring down the intensity of that, and that just adds a bit of extra something, I believe. By the way, set the color ramp to ease to have a smoother transition. And I still feel like the crust color is a bit off. Whoops, that is the wrong one. I'm just going to play with this a little until it feels more correct. That's moldy bread. There we go. That feels a bit better to me. Okay, so we have, and I'm just going to, I know I keep adjusting the colors. I'm just going to make this less intense. So we have a piece of bread. Congrats, everybody. We did it. We have a piece of bread, and now what I want to do is make a bunch of copies of it and also shrink wrap it. So here's how we do that. We could get fancy and make each piece of bread different. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a mesh line, and you're like, what is he thinking? I'm going to use a instance on points. We're going to instance on this line the piece of bread, and you can see this gives us a stack of bread. Make the separation between the points smaller, and that gives us a loaf of bread. Isn't that neat? And I don't know how many are in a loaf. I'm just going to make 16. And you could do some fancy stuff. If you wanted the end piece over here, just so you know, the way you would do that is using this greater than slider. Is it? Yeah. And that will create more of a crust everywhere, I believe. I think that's kind of what happened there. Either way, don't worry about it. We have this stack of bread. I'm going to transform it so it's actually sitting on the XY plane. So that's the x-axis by 90 degrees. And you could also transform it, whatever. Here we have our loaf of bread. Let's randomize it a little so it doesn't look so, boring. I'm going to make some pieces of bread as small as 0.9 on each axis. So this just varies the scale a little. I'm also going to add some random rotation by as much as negative 0.09 to 0.09 on the z-axis. So now it just looks more like a stack and not as boring. And you could also do the transform a little, but whatever. Next step is adding the shrink wrap. And you're like, oh, do I need to make a sphere and like ray cast it? You could. Or there's a node that you probably forgot about. And it's called convex hull. I almost forgot about it. What it does is it creates a, oh, we got to realize these instances. What it does is it creates a minimum convex surface that is a hull that covers it. And this is actually perfect for shrink wrapping. All I'm going to do with this, though, is I'm going to set position and scale it a little off the normal, just to make it a bit not stronger, a bit larger. So instead of 0, I'm just going to make it 5% bigger, just so it's not clinging to it. Actually, let's make it 2% bigger. And this deserves its own material as well. So I'm going to set material, create a new one, call it shrink wrap. And our shrink wrap will go here and join it with the bread. Okay, so I know it's looking weird, but that's just because of the shrink wrap material. The shrink wrap material, all we have to do, let's start off fresh. That's another bread pun for you. We're going to start with a principled BSDF. We are going to make it transmissive, which will make it see-through, so you can kind of see the bread underneath. We're going to make it reflective. By the way, we want to enable transparent glass. It's looking very glass-like and not shrink-wrap-like. The secret of this is the index of refraction, how much is light getting distorted. So I'm going to bring it not to 1, but very close to 1. And it will feel a little less reflective there. Also, I'm going to add in some noise, or I guess Musgrave is usually the way Ian Hubert recommends of doing this. Musgrave to add a bit of normal mapping so that there's a bit of distortion in this. There we go. It still looks like glass. I'm going to make it more transparent. That's actually kind of the key thing right there. Make it more transparent, I guess. And you can play with the IOR again. Ooh, that looks nice, actually. Let's bring it up. There we go. That actually looks better than the original that I made. Okay, there we go. Bring up the IOR, not down, turns out. And you can also play with the roughness, although you want to be careful because then it's going to start looking like glass if you go a bit too far. So I'm going to... That actually looks pretty good. Okay. Forget everything I said. That's the way you make it. And then finally, since it's Wonder Bread, we need those iconic dots. So I'm just wrapping up here because I got to blow my nose. Voronoi texture creates a bunch of dots. They're going to be stretched unless you use a object coordinate system. So that's what I would recommend. And I want to isolate the dots with a subtraction, a color ramp to make them like not a gradient, but just kind of like, well, I guess color ramp is kind of a weird way to do it, right? When we want the greater than node. This gives us our dots. Let's make less dots. And this will now go through a So we have dots, and I want them to either be yellow, blue, or red. So I want to randomize it. I think the way to do that is we also have this output right here. That can go into a color ramp as kind of like a black and white treated thing. And it can go to 3 colors. Red, yellow, yellow, or blue. There we go. That's the idea. So we're going to set this to constant, distribute from left, from left. So this is basically a way to say it's either going to be one of these 3 colors randomized, and I want to mix RGB so that it's either going to be this, or if it's not a dot at all, it's just going to carry over this white color. So here's what this looks like. That looks kind of iconic now. And okay, it's tried. I think the issue here is that it needs to not be transmissive in those areas. So I'm going to invert our dots. So now the dots should be black. Yeah, and then connect that to the transmission. And there we go. Now we're getting something a bit more Wonder Bread-like. Also, it's a bit too transparent in those areas. So what I'm going to do is a similar thing, although instead of a inversion, I'm going to color ramp it. So the alpha here should be 1, and then the alpha in the black areas should be 0.3, it seems. Something like that. See what that looks like. There we go. That's how you make the thing. Also, I guess, sorry, I guess another thing, they shouldn't be so reflective. Let's try connecting this here as well. And they're a bit too saturated. Okay. Hue saturation, bring it down by 20%. Okay, by 10%. And let's bring down the scale. And that, it looks a bit messy, but you can see the idea. And I need to get out of here at this point. You just want to play with the material. I think you want to mess with the IOR in these areas, and also mess with the bump. But you can see how you get there. And by the way, if you don't like your distribution, set this to 4-dimensional. That already looks better. And you can play with the dots and where they are. But I like the look of this. So hopefully this is the last sick tutorial I do. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. You can get the blend file on Patreon or in the link in the description on Gumroad, but if you want to support what I do here, Patreon is the way to do it, and I appreciate all my 600 to 700 patrons. Thank you so much. See you on the next one.